The news had come like a punch in the stomach, though it wasn't entirely unexpected. Emily had been in and out of doctors' offices for weeks now, her anxiety growing with each passing visit. The ultrasounds weren't showing what they had hoped. The baby, their first child, was not thriving as it should. The doctors had been kind but firm, telling them to prepare for the worst. And yet, Emily had allowed herself to hope. How could she not? This was the child she and Tom had dreamed of for years, the child they had planned for, talked about, loved, before it had even arrived. But now those hopes were crumbling around her, shattered by the harsh reality that no one had truly prepared her for. The cramping began on a Tuesday morning, gentle at first, then growing in intensity until it was undeniable. The bleeding came soon after, and the pain, sharp and brutal, dragged her to the hospital. Her mind raced with panic as she tried to tell herself it was nothing, that everything would be fine, but deep down she already knew. Tom had been at work when the news came. He had kissed her goodbye that morning, his usual smile hiding behind the veil of his exhaustion. He had promised he would be home early, that they would talk about the nursery, the baby names they still hadn't decided on, and whether they should start planning for daycare. He hadn't been able to shake the nagging sense that something was wrong either, but he had chosen not to voice it. They had been so excited for this baby. Their baby. Nothing could go wrong. But it had. By the time Tom arrived at the hospital, Emily had already been informed by a kind-faced nurse that they had lost the baby. A miscarriage, they said. They weren't sure what had caused it, but the doctors assured her that it was common. She wasn't alone in this, they said. You'll be okay, they said. But she wasn't okay. She couldn't be. Tom walked into her hospital room with a look of worry, his dark eyes scanning her face for any sign of her usual composure. When he saw her tears, the sudden collapse of her well-worn mask, his face contorted in confusion, he moved toward her quickly, sitting beside the bed and taking her hand gently in his. He didn't need words to ask what had happened. The look on her face said it all. "The baby's gone," Emily whispered, her voice a fragile thread. Tom's eyes widened, a mixture of disbelief and confusion running through them. He squeezed her hand, but his grip was uncertain, as if he didn't know how to comfort her. "I'm so sorry, Em. I don't know what to say." Words weren't enough, and they never would be. The silence between them stretched on, thick with a grief neither of them could yet understand. That night, Tom stayed by her side in the sterile, quiet hospital room. Emily lay there, her body aching both physically and emotionally, as the nurse left her to rest. She could hear Tom pacing the small space beside her, the sound of his shoes tapping softly on the linoleum floor. The reality of their loss settled over her like a weight she could barely breathe under. And yet, despite the devastation she felt, there was something else, something that, in that very moment, gnawed at her insides more than the grief itself. It was the isolation, the loneliness. Tom was there, but he wasn't. He was physically present, his body beside her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that his mind was somewhere far away. When she had lost their child, all she wanted was for him to be there, to feel it with her, to mourn together, to be the support she needed. But instead, there was distance between them. His gaze had flitted around the room as if searching for something to latch onto. She hadn't missed it, the way his eyes darted to the phone on his bedside table, his fingers twitching as if he were waiting for a message or a call or some kind of distraction. It had only been hours since their world had shattered, and yet Emily could already sense that Tom was not fully present in this shared grief. She didn't know if it was his own shock or his inability to connect to her pain, but the divide between them was starting to show. Emily, still trying to process the loss, felt her heart slowly pull away from him. She wanted to reach out to him, to beg him to show more, to be there for her. But when she looked at him, all she saw was a man in turmoil, trying to make sense of his own feelings, unable to comprehend the depths of hers. The hours stretched on as the hospital room grew colder, more sterile, more suffocating. Tom eventually fell asleep in the chair beside the bed, his hand still loosely clutching hers. But even in sleep, he didn't seem to let go of whatever it was that had consumed him. Emily stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep herself, and in the quiet of the night, her thoughts began to race. She had always prided herself on their closeness, their ability to communicate with ease, to share their lives in a way that felt like nothing could come between them. But now, she felt a yawning gap between them that seemed to widen with every passing second. The realization struck her harder than the cramping pain had, harder than the emptiness that followed the miscarriage. It wasn't just the loss of the child that hurt. It was the sense that she was now losing Tom in ways she hadn't prepared for. How could she possibly bear this kind of pain alone? As the morning sunlight filtered in through the hospital blinds, Emily sat up in bed, staring blankly at the muted sky. She could feel Tom stir beside her, his hand moving slowly to her arm. He didn't say anything immediately, but his touch was warm. It was the only sign of comfort she had in that moment, though it still felt like a distant gesture. She wanted to lean into him, but she felt a chasm growing between them that she couldn't cross. "Tom," she whispered, her voice raw. He looked at her, but she couldn't tell what was in his eyes. Was it guilt? Regret? Or was he just as lost as she was? "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice trembling now. I thought we'd be okay, together, but I don't know how to be okay without our baby, without this." Tom shifted uncomfortably. I don't know either, Em," he murmured, his voice low. "I don't know what to say or what to do." And there it was. The silence. The distance. As the day wore on and they were allowed to leave the hospital, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. What had begun as a hopeful, happy journey into parenthood had quickly turned into a nightmare. A nightmare that neither of them seemed equipped to face together. They left the hospital in a daze, the weight of the loss heavy between them. The car ride home was quiet, the hum of the engine a soft, relentless reminder of everything they had lost. In the days that followed, the emotional divide only seemed to widen. Tom tried to comfort her, but his efforts felt mechanical, as if he was unsure of how to deal with the grief that had overwhelmed them both. Emily, in turn, retreated into herself, her sadness turning inward, as though the very act of grieving was somehow too much to share. The support Emily so desperately needed was absent, and she felt the pain of that absence with every hour that passed. As she sat in their living room one evening, staring at the empty nursery they had yet to finish preparing, she realized that her grief had been compounded by something else. The quiet realization that in this moment, Tom had not been the rock she had believed him to be. Instead, he seemed as adrift as she was, and that perhaps was the most painful realization of all. The baby was gone, but it wasn't just the baby that had been lost. Something between them had shattered, and she wasn't sure if it could ever be repaired. It had been 2 weeks since the miscarriage, but it felt like an eternity. Emily woke up each day with a heavy, almost oppressive feeling, as though the weight of her grief had become her constant companion. The days blurred together. She spent most of her time in the house, retreating to the quiet corners where she could allow herself to feel everything. The sorrow, the anger, the confusion. Every room held a memory of the life she had imagined for her and Tom with their child. The nursery, now just an empty room with scattered boxes of unused baby clothes, sat in the back of her mind like a cruel reminder of what could have been. Tom had been distant, though Emily didn't have the energy to confront him about it. She couldn't bring herself to ask him why he seemed so withdrawn. She had her own grief to bear, and yet she couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in his behavior. He no longer looked at her with the same tenderness, the same love that had been so easy to see in his eyes before. His hands weren't as quick to reach for hers, his words weren't as soft or comforting. Instead, there were long silences when they were together, punctuated only by his occasional, half-hearted attempts to comfort her. He was still there, physically, but emotionally he seemed absent. Emily hated herself for even thinking it, but she wondered if maybe he was just as relieved as she was that the pregnancy was over. That thought came unbidden and filled her with guilt, as though she were betraying her own sorrow by considering the possibility that Tom was not mourning the loss in the same way she was. The thought lingered for days, gnawing at her, until she finally found the courage to bring it up. One evening, as they sat together on the couch in the living room, Tom flipping through the channels on the television while Emily stared at the blank screen, she could feel the tension in the room. It was as if there was an invisible barrier between them, one neither of them knew how to break down. The hum of the TV felt like a metaphor for their relationship, constant but distant. "Tom," Emily said quietly, her voice barely rising above the sound of the television. He didn't turn to her immediately, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Hmm?" She hesitated, gathering her thoughts. There was so much she wanted to say, but how could she say it without sounding petty, without sounding like she was accusing him of something he wasn't doing? The truth was, she had no idea what was going on with him. All she knew was that her heart ached not only for the child they had lost, but for the connection she felt slipping away between them. I don't know how to say this," she started, her voice trembling. "But I feel like we're not dealing with this loss together. It's like you're somewhere else, and I'm here, alone." Tom's eyes flicked over to her briefly, but he didn't stop flipping through channels. "What do you mean? I'm here, aren't I?" His words were dismissive, his tone far from reassuring. It stung, more than she cared to admit. She had expected a response, something, anything that might suggest he was aware of the distance growing between them, but instead, it felt as though he was brushing her off. Emily's chest tightened, a knot forming deep within her. "No, you're physically here," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "But emotionally, Tom, you're not. I feel like I'm going through all of this by myself." There was a pause, a brief moment of silence before Tom finally put the remote down and turned toward her. The expression on his face was one of frustration, but beneath it she could see something else, something darker. "I'm just trying to figure things out, Em," he said quietly, his voice betraying a hint of weariness. "This whole thing, it's hard for me too." Emily felt her heart skip a beat. She had been waiting for him to say something like that, something that might offer her the reassurance she so desperately needed, but hearing him say it so flatly, as though it was just another fact of life, only made her feel more isolated. "Hard for you?" she repeated, her voice a little sharper now. "You think this is hard for you? You think this is about you right now?" She could feel the anger rising within her, her emotions bubbling to the surface like a pot about to boil over. "What about me, Tom? What about the fact that I've lost our child, that I have to live with this pain every day?" Tom's eyes hardened and he leaned back into the couch, crossing his arms defensively. "I didn't ask for this either, Emily. I'm not the one who lost a baby, but that doesn't mean I'm not hurting." She wanted to scream at him, to shake him, to make him understand the depths of the pain she was feeling. But she didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she sat there in silence, her throat tight with unshed tears. "Then what are you doing, Tom?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why is it that you can't seem to be here for me? I need you more than ever, and you're not here, you're somewhere else." For a long moment, Tom said nothing. His gaze drifted to the floor, and for a brief instant, Emily wondered if he might say something to make her feel less alone in this unbearable grief. But then, something shifted in him. His expression grew guarded, distant. It was as though her words had hit him in a way that he couldn't quite process. His gaze flicked toward the phone on the coffee table, where it had been sitting face down for the past hour. "I don't know what you want me to say, Emily," he said, his voice flat now, almost empty. "I'm doing the best I can, but this is hard for me too." His eyes lingered on the phone for a beat too long. Emily noticed it, the way his fingers twitched, as if he wanted to reach for it. She could feel the sudden coldness between them, like the air had thickened, and her suspicions stirred once again. It wasn't just the loss of their child that was straining their relationship, it was something else. Something she wasn't fully aware of yet, but she could feel it. "Who have you been talking to, Tom?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. She regretted it instantly, but there it was, hanging in the air. His eyes met hers, and there was something in his gaze now. Something she couldn't quite place. It was a mixture of guilt and something else. Something he wasn't ready to admit. "No one," he said quickly, but the lie was so transparent that Emily could see through it in an instant. "Just work stuff." But Emily wasn't buying it. She had seen the way he had been checking his phone over the past few days, the subtle shifts in his behavior when he was on it, the sudden, unexplained disappearances. She knew it wasn't just work stuff. Tom, she said softly, her voice steady now though her heart pounded in her chest. I know you're lying to me. You've been talking to someone else, I can tell. His face twisted and he stood up abruptly. I'm not lying, he snapped, his voice rising now. I'm not doing anything wrong. Why are you doing this? Emily stood too, stepping closer to him. I'm not doing anything wrong, Tom. I just want to know who it is. Who have you been talking to when you should be here with me? Why are you pulling away from me when I need you the most? For a long moment there was silence between them. Tom's face flushed with something, frustration, guilt, anger, and Emily's heart sank as she waited for the truth to finally come to the surface. Finally, Tom let out a deep sigh, his shoulders sagging with the weight of whatever he had been carrying. It's Sarah, he admitted quietly, almost as if the words physically hurt to say. My ex-wife. She's been going through her own stuff and I've been helping her. She needed someone. Emily felt as though the floor had just been ripped out from under her. Sarah, of course it was Sarah. He had been spending his time comforting his ex-wife while Emily was left to deal with the deepest loss of her life. Sarah? Emily repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. You've been comforting Sarah, your ex-wife? When I'm here? Losing our child? Ugh. Tom nodded, avoiding her gaze. She needed me, Em. I didn't know what to do. She's been struggling with her own issues. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just trying to be there for her, but I'm here for you too. You know that, right? Emily stood frozen, the weight of his words crashing over her like a wave. She had been grieving their loss, but now she felt something worse. Betrayed. Tom had chosen to comfort Sarah instead of being there for her, instead of supporting his wife, the woman he had promised to stand by in times of hardship, the woman who had just lost their child. The realization hit her hard, and it felt like she was suffocating. He had given part of himself to someone who wasn't even part of their life anymore, and in doing so, he had left her with nothing but emptiness. The days following Tom's revelation were the hardest Emily had ever faced. Each morning she woke up with the overwhelming sense of loss that had been with her since the miscarriage, but now there was an added weight, a sharp sting in her chest that she couldn't escape. The realization that Tom had been emotionally unavailable, pulling away from her when she needed him most, and choosing to help his ex-wife Sarah instead, left her feeling betrayed in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about Sarah. It wasn't just about the fact that Tom had been comforting his ex-wife during one of the most painful moments of their lives. It was the way it made her feel invisible, unimportant, like her pain didn't matter. Emily had never imagined a scenario where Tom, the man she had built a life with, would choose someone else over her, someone who wasn't even part of their life anymore. But now here she was, stuck in a relationship that felt as fragile as the day they had lost their child. The emotional divide between them had widened to an insurmountable distance, and Emily couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that things could never go back to the way they were. How could they? How could she look at Tom the same way when she knew he had been so emotionally absent at a time when she needed him most? The house felt colder now. It was like walking through a maze of silence. Tom, though physically present, seemed a shadow of the man she had once known. He spent his days either in the garage working on some project or retreating into his phone, his fingers swiping absent-mindedly, just as they had before. It wasn't that he was actively avoiding her, it was more that he didn't know how to be there for her, and worse, it seemed like he didn't want to know. Each time she tried to engage with him, to bring up their situation, he deflected, brushed it aside, or simply didn't respond in a meaningful way. Emily had come to a painful realization. The emotional intimacy they had once shared had dissolved, leaving nothing behind but a hollow shell of a relationship. One morning, after a week of barely speaking, Emily had had enough. She couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. She couldn't keep letting Tom's avoidance go unchecked. She had to confront him, had to make him understand the depth of her hurt, or they would be lost forever. There was no more time for silence. She found him in the kitchen, making coffee, his movements mechanical. He didn't even look up as she entered, his back turned to her as he fiddled with the coffee machine. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. The conversation that had been building between them for weeks was about to erupt. Tom, she said, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. He didn't respond immediately, but she saw him tense, his back straightening as though he could sense the change in the air. The coffee machine gurgled as the coffee dripped into the pot, but neither of them paid it any mind. "Tom," Emily repeated, her voice firmer this time. She wasn't going to back down. "We need to talk." He turned around then, his face unreadable. "About what?" His tone was flat, as if he didn't quite understand the gravity of the situation. Emily felt a surge of frustration rise within her. "About everything, Tom," she said, stepping closer. "About what's been going on between us. About what's been going on with you." His jaw clenched, and for a moment Emily thought he might turn away again. She could see the hesitation in his eyes, the way he was weighing his options, but she wasn't going to let him walk away this time. Not again. "I don't know what you're talking about," Tom said, his voice tight now, almost defensive. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, to not let the emotions overwhelm her. "I'm talking about the fact that you've been absent, Tom. Emotionally, mentally, you've been gone. And you've been helping her, Sarah, while I'm here, dealing with this on my own." She could see him stiffen at the mention of Sarah's name, his eyes narrowing slightly, a flicker of guilt passing through them, but he quickly masked it, turning away from her and moving toward the counter. "I told you I've been helping her," he said, his voice low. "She's going through a hard time too. It's not like I can just turn my back on her. We're friends, Emily, you know that." Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her chest tightened and she took a step closer, her voice rising. "Friends? Friends? Tom, you're married to me. I'm the one you made vows to. You're supposed to be here for me. And instead you're comforting her, your ex-wife, like I don't even exist?" His face reddened slightly, and for a moment Emily thought she might finally get the answer she was searching for, the truth that had been buried under his defensiveness and avoidance. "You don't understand, Emily," Tom said, his voice strained now. "She needs me. She's been through so much and I can't just ignore that." Emily felt the sting of his words deep in her chest. How could he justify this? How could he place someone else's pain above hers? She had lost their child. She had lost the future they had been building together, and he was acting as if he was some kind of martyr for helping Sarah through her own problems. "Do you hear yourself?" Emily asked, her voice breaking. "You're telling me you're helping her, but you're hurting me. You're choosing her, Tom. You're choosing her over your wife." Tom shook his head, a frustrated sigh escaping his lips. "I'm not choosing anyone, Emily. I'm just trying to be there for people I care about. You think this is easy for me? Do you think I'm not affected by what happened to our baby?" The words hit her harder than she anticipated, and for a moment Emily was stunned into silence. Of course she knew he was grieving too, but his grief had been buried so deeply, hidden behind layers of avoidance, that she hadn't been able to connect with him. The pain she had assumed was mutual, a shared burden, now seemed like a solitary experience for each of them. "Then be here, Tom," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Be here with me. I need you, but you keep pulling away. I can't do this alone. I can't heal when you're not even looking at me." Tom's face faltered, the hardened expression beginning to crack. "I don't know how, Emily. I don't know what you need from me. You're grieving, and I'm grieving, but I don't know how to fix this. I don't know what to do." The rawness of his confession surprised her. For all his avoidance, for all the times he had shut her out, this was the first time he had shown vulnerability. It was the first time he admitted that he too was lost in the aftermath of their tragedy. Emily felt a surge of compassion for him, but it was quickly overshadowed by her own hurt. "I need you to choose me, Tom," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I need you to choose us, our marriage, over whatever unresolved feelings you have for her. I can't fight this battle by myself." Tom stood there for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the floor. Emily waited, heart in her throat, hoping for some kind of answer, some indication that he was finally seeing her, that he was finally ready to stand beside her in this shared grief. Finally, Tom lifted his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and confusion. "I don't know if I can do that," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The words sliced through Emily like a knife. She had been hoping for a resolution, for some sense of closure that would help them move forward together, but now she saw it clearly. Tom wasn't ready. He wasn't ready to choose her. Not yet. Tears welled in Emily's eyes as the weight of his words sank in. She had been waiting for him to come back to her, to find his way back to the woman he had once loved so deeply. But it was clear now that he wasn't capable of it, not in the way she needed him to. "I can't keep waiting, Tom," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't keep waiting for you to figure it out while I fall apart. I need someone who will choose me, and right now, that's not you." Tom looked like he was about to say something more, but no words came. Instead, he simply stood there, helpless, as Emily turned away from him, the silence between them now deafening. She didn't know what would happen next, but in that moment, she knew that whatever they had once had was slipping away, piece by piece. The days following their confrontation were the hardest Emily had ever endured. The silence between her and Tom had become a chasm so wide that it felt as though they were living in entirely different worlds. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't bridge the divide between them. Each day felt like an exercise in endurance, where she had to find a way to get through the hours without breaking down completely. It was clear now that the emotional bond they once shared had weakened beyond repair, leaving only remnants of what had been. Tom, for his part, had grown quieter, retreating further into himself. She had seen it before, the way he shut down when things became too difficult, the way he could no longer face what was happening between them. She had seen it after their early arguments, after stressful periods in their relationship, but this time it felt different. The distance between them wasn't just a temporary rift. It was a fundamental shift in their connection, one that neither of them seemed capable of reversing. Emily spent most of her time alone in their house. She wandered through the rooms, now filled with the haunting echoes of their shared memories, and couldn't help but think about how things used to be. She remembered the way Tom used to laugh with her late at night, how they would plan their future together with excitement and anticipation. She remembered the small, loving gestures that had once been the foundation of their marriage, but now everything seemed faded, like a photograph left in the sun too long. The baby's things still lay untouched in the nursery. The crib, the clothes, the soft toys, everything was still there, waiting. But Emily couldn't bring herself to pack it all away, couldn't bring herself to get rid of the dreams they had shared for their child. As painful as it was, she couldn't let go. Not yet. The room stood as a silent testament to what could have been, and in a way it was a place where she could hold on to the memory of the child they had lost. It wasn't just the loss of the baby that tore them apart, it was everything that had followed. The misunderstandings, the emotional avoidance, Tom's increasing distance, his devotion to Sarah, his ex-wife, and Emily realized that she had spent too long hoping for something to change. She had spent too long clinging to the idea of what their marriage could be, while Tom seemed to have already moved on from the life they had built together. Her heart ached for the man he had once been. She had loved him deeply, and the thought of losing him was like a slow death, a quiet unraveling of everything she had once believed in. But she could no longer wait for him to change, no longer wait for him to choose her. One afternoon, Emily found herself sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of her. The house was quiet, the hum of everyday life muffled by the heaviness in the air. Tom had gone out to run errands, and she knew that it would be a while before he came back. The time alone had become both a blessing and a curse. She had the space to think, but with it came the unbearable weight of loneliness. She wasn't sure how much longer she could continue in this state of limbo. The waiting had become excruciating, and as much as she didn't want to admit it, she knew the truth. Their marriage was over. It had died long before they had lost their child, but the loss of the baby had been the final blow. There was no going back now. Her phone buzzed on the table, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from her sister, Anna. "I'm coming over later today. I think we need to talk. Call me when you can." Emily stared at the message for a moment, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. Anna had been a constant source of support throughout this entire ordeal. She had listened when Emily needed to vent, comforted her when she cried, and offered her a safe space when the world outside felt too overwhelming. Emily knew that Anna had been worried about her, and now it seemed like her sister was ready to address the elephant in the room. The unspoken truth that had been hanging over them all for weeks. As the hours passed, Emily's mind raced with thoughts of what her conversation with Anna might bring. She wasn't sure what she wanted to hear anymore. She didn't know if she was looking for answers, validation, or just someone to tell her it was going to be okay. The idea that things could be okay again felt almost laughable. She had already tried to make sense of it all, and the more she tried, the more elusive the truth became. By the time Anna arrived that afternoon, Emily was already sitting on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Anna walked into the room with her usual warm smile, but there was a cautiousness in her step, a hesitation in her movements that immediately made Emily realize this conversation would be different. Her sister wasn't just here to comfort her anymore. She was here to confront the situation head-on. Instead of admiring her for her kind and generous spirit, Anna sat down beside Emily, her eyes soft but full of concern. "How are you holding up?" she asked gently. Emily shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I don't know anymore, Anna. I don't know how to keep pretending like everything is okay, because it's not. Tom, he's not here, not really, and I don't think he ever will be again." Anna didn't respond immediately. She simply sat there, her gaze unwavering. After a moment, she sighed deeply. "I know," she said softly. "I've been watching you, Em, and I can see it in your eyes. I can see how much you're hurting, and I can see how much you've been trying to make things work, but the truth is, Tom has been checked out for a while now. I'm not saying it's your fault, but I think you need to face the fact that he's not coming back to you, at least not in the way you need him to." Emily felt the tears welling in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She couldn't. "I thought I could fix things. I thought if I was patient enough, he would come around, that he would realize that he's lost me too, that he would see how much I need him. But it's like he's already moved on, Anna. It's like I'm invisible to him." Anna reached out and placed her hand on Emily's. "You're not invisible, Em, not to me. But I think you're right. I think you've given everything to this relationship, and Tom, he hasn't been able to give you what you need. And that's not something you can change, not on your own." The weight of Anna's words settled into Emily's chest like a heavy stone. She had known it deep down all along, but hearing her sister say it out loud made it all the more real. Tom had chosen to be absent, to retreat into his grief and his relationship with Sarah, and Emily had been left standing alone, waiting for something that would never come. "Maybe it's time to let go," Emily whispered, the words barely audible. "Maybe it's time for me to stop waiting for something that isn't going to happen." Anna squeezed her hand tightly, offering her silent support. "I know it's hard, Em, but you deserve more than this. You deserve to be loved, to be supported. And if Tom can't give you that, then you need to make a decision about what's best for you." The room was quiet for a long time after that. Emily's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Grief, confusion, sadness. But above all, she felt a strange sense of relief. She had been holding on to something for so long, and now, finally, she was starting to let go. That evening, when Tom came home, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Emily knew what she had to do. She couldn't keep living in this limbo. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when she knew it wasn't. When he walked through the door, she stood up from the couch, her heart pounding in her chest. "Tom, we need to talk," she said, her voice steady but filled with finality. He looked at her, confusion flashing in his eyes, but he didn't say anything. He simply nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I can't do this anymore," Emily said, her voice breaking as she spoke the words she had been avoiding for weeks. "I can't keep waiting for you to come back to me. I need to move on. I need to heal. And I can't do that while you're not here. Not really." Tom stood frozen for a moment, as if the weight of her words hadn't fully registered. "Emily, please," he began, but she held up her hand, silencing him. "No, Tom. I've given everything I have to this marriage, and you've given me nothing in return. I need to let go, for both of us." And with those words, the final piece of their marriage fell away. There was no more hope, no more expectation, just the quiet finality of a relationship that had run its course. The rest of the night passed in silence. Tom didn't argue, he didn't beg her to stay. He simply packed a bag and left, the sound of the door closing behind him marking the end of their life together. Emily stood alone in the quiet of their home, a strange mix of sadness and relief filling her. It was over. And though the pain would remain for a while, she knew that she had made the right decision. She had chosen herself.